Are you aged between 18 and 60 and speak English, Spanish, or Ukrainian? Then you could be one of the foreign heroes helping Ukraine fight off Putin's army right on the battlefield. All roles in the Ukrainian military except officers are currently open, and the pay can range up to $3,300 in a combat position. Incidentally, prior military and combat service is not a requirement, but is preferred. Interested? Well, you're not the only one. Here's the backstory. When Russia launched its attack on Ukraine, a global wave of support for Ukraine emerged. The UN General Assembly overwhelmingly condemned the invasion. Western countries united in sanctions against Russia and provided military aid to Ukraine. Despite President Volodymyr Zelensky's declaration that Ukraine must carry its battle alone, the nation has welcomed support of thousands of foreign fighters since the conflict's escalation on February 24, 2022. But who are these international volunteers, and what has been their impact on the ground in Ukraine? What risks do they face? This video dives into the stories of these brave individuals contributing to Ukraine's defense and explores the reality of their commitment on the front lines. All wars have attracted the participation of volunteers from countries not directly involved in the conflict. The Ukrainian conflict is no exception, and foreigners have been fighting there in large numbers as early as the Donbass War. The Sufan Center think tank estimated that about 17,200 foreigners were taking part in hostilities in Ukraine between 2014 and 19. After the full-scale invasion began, Ukraine wasted no time in encouraging friendly fighters to join its ranks. On February 27, 2022, Zelensky established the International Legion of Territorial Defense of Ukraine, or Ukrainian Foreign Legion for short, by presidential decree. There are also other foreign units not specifically attached to the Foreign Legion, but still operating as part of the Ukrainian army. Shortly after the invasion, when the world's outrage was at its height, swarms of foreign volunteers flocked into Ukraine, heeding Zelensky's call. There may have been between 20,000 and 30,000 such volunteers at the height of such enlistments. Foreign volunteers from more than 60 countries have been recorded in the Ukrainian ranks. The establishment of a foreign legion was a controversial item internationally and brought tensions between Ukraine and the countries that would ordinarily be its allies. Many countries have laws which forbid their nationals from participating in units like Ukraine's Foreign Legion. In a few cases, soldiers on active duty have deserted their own country's ranks to join Ukraine's. In March 2022, a South Korean former naval special warfare officer turned YouTuber named Ken Ree and 4 British soldiers faced criminal charges and court-martials for leaving their respective countries to fight for Ukraine. Other countries, like the United States, do not have laws prohibiting individuals from enlisting, but have advised their nationals to not participate in the hostilities. That hasn't stopped many of them from doing so. The Ukrainian Foreign Legion lists its requirements for joining on its official website. Recruits must be between 18 and 60 and speak English, Spanish, or Ukrainian. They must not have criminal records, pass a physical fitness and medical exam, and have the ability to legally enter Ukraine. Prior military and combat service is not a requirement, but is preferred. Oh, and all the roles in Ukraine's military except officers are open to its foreign recruits. And if you're thinking about joining in and need some additional motivation, let's talk about your paycheck next. The pay scale ranges from a basic $600 per month, $1,200 for deployment in a dangerous area, and $3,300 in a combat position. Injured soldiers get free medical treatment and special payouts if they suffer from a disability. Families of fallen soldiers can expect $400,000 in compensation. Foreign veterans can stay for the long term in Ukraine, and their service is a pathway to citizenship. According to the Foreign Legion's website, contracts last for 3 years and can be prolonged automatically. Recruits can terminate the contract unilaterally, but not if they are currently deployed in combat. Perhaps the most famous foreign units in Ukraine are the Freedom of Russia Legion and the Russian Volunteer Corps. These groups consist of former Russian soldiers who have defected from their motherland. The Legion and Volunteer Corps' most notable exploit was the Belgorod raid of May 22 to 23, 2023, where they claimed the liberation of several villages, the creation of a demilitarized zone, and came within a few miles of a nuclear weapons storage facility. The Russian authorities were forced to evacuate the weapons in response to the raid. On the 23rd, Russian authorities insisted they had repelled the raid and killed more than 70 of the Legion and Volunteer Corps members in the process, destroying 4 armored vehicles and 5 pickups for good measure. However, the Russians seem to have protested too much. The Institute for the Study of War noted the success of the raid by the measure of Russia's response to it. Russian forces should not have required significant reinforcements or the involvement of a colonel general to repulse a raid conducted by reportedly 13 armored vehicles. Cross-border raids into Belgorod continued to the middle of June. Because the Legion and Volunteer Corps consist of Russian nationals, they are ideally suited for such operations. They can blend in easily and likely know the lay of the land. The Legion and the Volunteer Corps have different ideologies, however. The Legion's stated goal is the liberation of Russia from Putinism. According to the group's spokesman, a man known by his codename Caesar, the group adheres to moderate centrist views. In addition to the Legion's participation in operations in Belgorod Oblast, it's also taken part in the bitter battle of Bakhmut. Our ultimate goal is liberation from the Putin regime and serious reforms to our country. Otherwise, the whole world will not be safe, because Russia has embarked once more on the path of aggression, the path of capture, the path of destruction. We want Russia to turn inward and live a calm and peaceful life, Caesar said in an interview with Australian media during the Wagner Rebellion at the end of June 2023. Meanwhile, the Russian Volunteer Corps has been linked to neo-Nazi ideology. Its leader is Denis White Rex Kapustin, who openly calls for the creation of an ethnic Russian monostate, a goal based on the Volunteer Corps' Homo ethnicus worldview. The divergence between the two Russian groups reveals that the foreign fighters in Ukraine all have their own personal reasons for being there. The presence of neo-Nazi elements among the pro-Ukrainian forces is a problem for Kyiv, as Putin undertook his special military operation for the purpose of demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine. The Volunteer Corps' presence in the Ukrainian ranks assists his propaganda in justifying the war. It's notable that the Freedom of Russia Legion is on the official rolls of Ukraine's Foreign Legion, but the Russian Volunteer Corps is not. Other segments of the Ukrainian Foreign Legion include soldiers recruited from surprising areas. These include the Bolivar Battalion, with soldiers coming from countries in Latin America, although there are also Ukrainians, Australians, and Americans fighting in this unit. The battalion is commanded by a Venezuelan national named José David Chaparro Martinez, who has deep ties to Ukraine, arriving there for the first time in 1989. From 2001 to 2005, he spent time in Russia as the charge d'affaires of the Venezuelan diplomatic corps. Although his wife and children are Ukrainian, his homeland is not far from his mind. He has accused Russia of helping to turn Venezuela into a social laboratory and of deploying Wagner mercenaries to guard gold mines and oil deposits. Martinez was in Kyiv at the start of the invasion, and as Spanish-speaking fighters began arriving, he began to take charge of their welcome and training. Martinez shares the goal of expelling Russia from Ukraine, but hopes that the experience his soldiers accrue in the conflict can one day help to liberate Venezuela from the regime of Nicolas Maduro. The Zokhar Dudayev Battalion is another of the more interesting units under the Foreign Legion's official umbrella. This is a battalion of anti-Russia Chechen volunteers, and it was established in 2014. The unit is named after the assassinated leader of the Chechen independence movement of the 1990s. Its first commander, Isa Manayev, was killed in action during the Battle of Debaltseve in 2015, where Ukrainian troops were forced to retreat from pro-Russian separatist forces. After the full-scale invasion began, the battalion grew in size, with many of the new arrivals coming from Western Europe. These men were exiles from the Chechen Wars in the 1990s and early 2000s. By December 2022, the battalion numbered several hundred members who have proclaimed themselves the sworn enemies of the Chechen fighters serving Putin's cause under the Chechen Republic's current dictator, Ramzan Kadyrov. One of the battalion's more notable campaigns was in the defense of Kyiv. The battalion's current commander, Adam Osmayev, insisted that his people and Ukrainians were allies and that the latter should not judge all Chechens by the actions of those fighting under Kadyrov's banner. There are other units of Chechens, including the Kamzat Galayev Detachment and Ichkarian Special Purpose Battalion. Crimean Tatars were also joining the Ukrainian cause in significant numbers and fought in the defense of Kyiv. As the Tatars had historically been subject to mass killings, deportations, and cultural genocide at the hands of Russian authorities, their joining in the fight against Moscow was less surprising. They do not have a formal unit on the rolls of Ukraine's Foreign Legion, however. Ukraine also once had a unit of Belarusian volunteers, known as the Pahonia Regiment. At its height, the group claimed it had between 450 and 500 troops, about as big as an average Ukrainian battalion. Its members saw the fight against Russia in Ukraine as part of the liberation of their own country from Moscow's puppet ruler, Alexander Lukashenko, who the Kremlin propped up after mass protests against its 2020 presidential election, which all international observers claim was fraudulent. In April 2022, the group claimed that several thousand more people were trying to join its ranks. Aside from the defense of Kyiv, the regiment took part in the Battle of Bakhmut, where at least one of its fighters was killed. The group was disbanded in July 2023, according to an announcement from Radio Free Europe. There are other units of foreign fighters that are not officially part of the Foreign Legion, but nevertheless operate under the command of Ukraine's Ministry of Defense. One of the more famous of these is the Norman Brigade. The brigade is an international organization. Its former commander, 38-year-old Rolf, a Canadian military veteran whose real name is Jean-François Rattel and who was later killed in action, said in an interview with the Washington Post that the unit consists of fighters from 12 countries: Canada, the United States, Portugal, Spain, Italy, the United Kingdom, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Jordan, and Egypt. Other foreign fighters in Ukraine have gone there to escape the often harsh transition from military to civilian life. One former British captain who signed on to fight in Ukraine rather than take a desk job back home was almost killed by an artillery strike at Bakhmut. Nevertheless, he said he is now happier than he's ever been. "The last 9 months have been the best, most enjoyable of my life," he said. "I can't go sit in an office and do PowerPoint for the next 50 years. There's a part of me that's doing it for the right reasons, and there's a part of me that's doing it for the violence. It's kind of a bit of both." An American who fought in Ukraine for about 6 months said that he had observed a Valhalla mindset in many of his comrades. He claimed they wanted to die a soldier's death while taking out as many Russians as possible. For them, it was a way to escape their alienation from a system they believe they didn't have a place in. Many others simply wanted to lend their skills to help what they viewed as a just cause against Vladimir Putin's aggressive tendencies. For them, if Putin was not stopped in Ukraine, he would keep going, and that's not a world they wanted to see. However, not everything is rosy in the relationship between the Ukrainian forces and their foreign comrades. Desertion is common in the Foreign Legion and other foreign units in Ukraine. There are some reports that, although the Legion offers minimal resistance against such desertion, it has asked some of its personnel to sign indefinite contracts. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense denied this, but refused to share copies of the contracts with the media in early 2022. The number of foreign fighters may have reached between 20,000 and 30,000 shortly after the war began, but today only a fraction remains. Most estimates now range between 1,000 and 3,000. Ben Atkin, an 18-year-old British national who had no military training but who still joined the Foreign Legion in the early months of the war out of a sense of duty and outrage, described in an interview with Britain's Channel 4 that many of the promises Ukraine made had been broken. When he crossed the border from Poland, Atkin had told he'd be provided with weapons and armor and be doing civilian-focused duties for the next 3 months. However, upon reaching the Legion's camp, he was told he would need to surrender his passport, that the 3-month tour of duty would most likely be for 3 years, and there would be no weapons training. Atkins says that he was asked to go to the front line in Donetsk Oblast in 24 hours. For him, it was too much, and he decided to help the humanitarian effort in Ukraine instead. A former Royal Navy engineer who Channel 4 identified only as Chris described the foreign contingents as being poorly organized and filled with Call of Duty-type people, absolute chaos. These people were even allowed to post TikTok videos of themselves with their location, the Yavoriv training base in Lviv. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the base was hit by a barrage of Russian cruise missiles. Fortunately for Chris, he and 150 of his more experienced comrades had decided to leave that location without any orders. But his fight wasn't over. He was sent to Irpin, which at the time was under intense shelling as part of Russia's Kyiv campaign. Curtis claimed he and his unit had little intelligence or support from Ukraine's military during this operation. He had to buy his own food. He returned to the UK in 2 months. Although Atkin and Curtis's complaints came early in the war, they have persisted. One of the fallen foreign fighters in Ukraine was a Canadian veteran named Joseph Hildebrand, who was killed in the Battle of Bakhmut. His friend, another Canadian and paratrooper veteran, claimed in a Washington Post interview in January 2023 that Hildebrand had been sent on a suicide mission. This man left Ukraine after 4 months fighting there, claiming that the Ukrainian ranks lacked training and professionalism and panicked a lot. Indeed, Atkin and other foreigners who joined or who have tried to join Ukraine said that they will be treated as cannon fodder. A soldier with the Foreign Legion from Finland, callsign Hobbit, said in a September 2023 interview with Germany's DW News that Ukraine's view of fighters like him was that they made their best contributions to the war by becoming casualties. That way, the West would continue to send support out of a sense that these governments needed to defend their own people fighting there. Adjustment even for those with military training and experience in the war on terror has proven difficult. These men are used to being in an environment with air support on standby and complete artillery superiority. The experience in Ukraine is very different. They are no longer facing asymmetrical opponents, but a peer-fighting force with massed artillery, armor, missiles, and air support of its own, firepower they had never seen in Iraq or Afghanistan. Some of the foreign fighters interviewed by DW News described their experiences differently and in a more positive light. Caleb List, a volunteer from Australia who became a platoon commander, described much better organization and care than Curtis had in British media, suggesting that things have gotten better over time. In assessing the overall effectiveness of the Foreign Legion and other international fighters in Ukraine, Frank Ledwidge, a former intelligence officer in the British Armed Forces, said that at the tactical level, these units ranged in quality from highly effective to marginally so. But because there are only a few thousand of them anyway, they don't make a big difference. Rather, their biggest contribution, particularly for the Western fighters, is at the strategic level. Their presence provides a blood stake and forces Western governments to keep Ukraine a high priority. Ledwidge was most worried about the foreigners getting no thanks or institutional support for their mental and physical health upon returning home, since they had not served in an official war for their homelands, while still facing a far more intense enemy than the thousands of wounded from the War on Terror had seen during their tough service. Up-to-date casualty figures are hard to come by. In early 2023, Ukrainian sources claimed that 100 foreign fighters had been killed in action. At least 1,000 more have been wounded. These figures are likely understatements. There are other dangers for foreign fighters. Russian forces do not regard these people as legitimate combatants, but rather mercenaries or even foreign intelligence agents. As a result, Russia will not consider fighters that it captures from Ukraine's foreign units to be legitimate prisoners of war. Two Americans who were captured during the fighting, Alex Drukian and Andy Hine, described being physically beaten by Russian soldiers in a truck as they crossed the border. The beatings continued in captivity. There, in bed-bug-infested conditions, they were often beaten awake in the small hours of the morning. Sleep deprivation and dehydration were standard procedures. During interrogations, the men were subjected to electric shocks. They were also put into stress positions, which Drukian describes as worse than the punches he took. The two men said that the Russians often accused them of being CIA agents. They were forced to appear on Russian television and deliver propagandistic statements praising Putin. Failure to do so, they said, would see them raped, amputated, and murdered. They were eventually freed as part of a prisoner exchange mediated by Saudi Arabia, but on their way to freedom, the Russians gave them one last punishment. They were again bound tightly in uncomfortable positions. Their discomfort was to the point that they wanted to die, rather than suffer through it, even though they knew they were about to be exchanged. Despite this, the two men said they have no regrets about going to Ukraine. This may be a common item among the foreign fighters as a whole. Despite Curtis's bitter criticisms, he too said that he hoped to return and continue the fight. All wars have attracted adventurers, with ambitious young men and women seeing an opportunity to break out of mundane life and prove themselves by fighting for a just cause. Inevitably, the reality of the experience starts to fray those notions for some, but others see it differently. This has been the case in Ukraine, with many of the remaining foreign fighters having developed into some of the war's most battle-hardened troops, and these people are in it for the long haul. What do you think about the foreign fighters in Ukraine? What have been their most significant contributions? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more military analysis from military experts. Now go check out how Ukraine's female snipers are hunting down Russians, or click this other video instead.